You know, I loved trains growing up. There was a little train at this place I used to go to when I was a child. It was at Jaybird Springs. It was in Georgia. And they had a spring-fed pool. And I used to go there, and they had this little miniature train I was obsessed with as a kid. Loved going there. Would always play on it. And so it's the irony is here I am in Richmond, and behind me, right, I'm sitting actually where there were train tracks that went through. And this is the tunnel that went under Churchill. It's called the Churchill Tunnel. Yeah, I know, novel, right? I'm being Captain Obvious. The reason why I'm sitting here is I wanted to use this as an example, right? And the example is that in 1927 there was a terrible disaster that occurred here. And what occurred here was there were a bunch of workers on a train inside this repairing the tunnel. They were having problems with it. They were worried about it collapsing, and it collapsed on the workers. The train and the workers are still in there. Yeah, so this is basically a graveside, right? But long before things got to the point where it was that bad, there had been many warnings and miniature collapses. There were signs of the disaster everywhere. People didn't listen, right? They ignored it. They ignored the fact that something was structurally wrong with the tunnel, and it was dangerous, and to the point where, well, calamity occurred. Now, the reason why they could never excavate it and get any of the bodies out, or even go back years later, even recently, is because it's still unsafe. Because now there's all these homes that have been built, and homes that were still there during that time period up on Churchill. And they're worried about further collapse and sinkholes opening up and it destabilizing all the foundations of the homes. Now I want you to think about that as a metaphor for people and nations, right? You know, when the empire of Babylon fell, it fell because the Medo-Persians tunneled underneath the city using the waterways, right, that went underneath the city, underneath the gates. They tunneled underneath. They basically came out on the other side and took the city from within. I want you to use that as a metaphor for people and nations. Now, why am I telling you this? Why am I telling you this when I'm sitting here, right? Well, I'm telling you this because when you ignore the warnings, when you ignore the warning signs, right, you create the conditions for a catastrophic breakdown. Same thing with people as it is for nations. So, as I tell you this, I'm telling you this because you've got structural integrity issues here in America. You've got problems from the ground up. Some of you may have heard me refer to the fact that, when I say things like you are drying up the depths, right? Meaning that you're creating conditions economically and have been creating them for quite some time, where you're drying up the depths of which the people that are the elite, right, the ruling class, the moneyed class, the 1% down to the 20%, right, are able to actually remain in their high purchase in the land. When you do that, you're creating structural integrity issues, meaning that when you are undermining, right, the foundations on which you've built things, ultimately you will face a collapse of that foundation underneath you, and it will bring everything come tumbling down, right? Everything will come tumbling down. Sorry, it's a little late. I'm tired. So, the same thing happens in terms of when you're dealing with ideologies, right? Worldview. When you're dealing with policies, whether foreign and domestic, right? Both work together, right? They should be integrated. When you follow an either-or paradigm, which is what happens far too often, what winds up happening is you create the conditions where you're undermining your position. When you're in denial, right, of your predicament, you create the conditions that undermine your position, right? So I want you to think about what happened back here, and I want you to put that in the context of the warnings that were given for a long time about the condo, right, that collapsed down in Florida, right? Many warnings, right? Now, how much more important is it for you to come to your senses and to think through what you're doing now and be humble enough to listen when it involves the entirety of your nation, when it involves the future of your country, the health and well-being of the people, and you're standing among the rest of the nations in the world. You see, everything is connected. Nothing happens in a vacuum here, right? So when there are warnings presented to you, right, and wisdom offered to you, which has happened, all throughout your history, going all the way back, read George Washington's farewell address, right? Perfect example, right? Eisenhower, go and read the speeches of Kennedy, right? When people warn you of something, they're not warning you because they despise you, because they hate you. They're warning you because they care. If they didn't care about you, they wouldn't warn you. Now, you may not like how they warn you, and they may do a poor job at articulating it, but nevertheless, they still warn you. That's why I warn you. When I warn you of certain things, it's not because I'm trying to be mean or rude or hateful towards you. It's because I care about you. I have a heart to care about you. And I care about this nation and the people that are within. I also care about how our policies, right, affect other nations, right? No nation state lives in a vacuum by itself. Now, empires like to think that they do, and superpowers like to think that they do. But the truth of the matter is no one does. Everything is connected here. So when you consider that, right, and then you consider the fact that there are those who are always trying to undermine you, right, and your own choices, your own decisions, right? What happens with pride, greed, fear, confusion, and that being fueled as well, right, by your adversaries, well, that's an undermining, right? And eventually, it creates structural integrity issues, right? And those structural integrity issues ultimately lead to collapse, like what happened back here. And people suffer. Now, when that occurs, the people that are at the top, right, wind up on the bottom with everybody else. The most recent example of structural integrity failure, right, that really started this entire, part of our nation's history off was 9/11. When the towers fell, when they pancaked onto the ground, and all those people died, right? There is a consequence, right, to ignoring warnings. There were warnings. People were concerned about another event happening at those towers. There were also warnings, right, that went unheeded or did not make it through proper channels, right, on 9/11 or prior to 9/11 to be able to prevent 9/11. Even those events are, as terrible as they are examples to you of a bigger warning, and that is a warning about the structural integrity of your country and the trajectory that your nation has been on. So it is wise to heed that advice. If you try to rule and run things by fear and confusion, or you remain in your pride, you will ultimately only add to the problems that lead to a faster dissipation of your position and an undermining of your ability, right, to actually deal with the situation as it is. That means you increase complexity. And if you increase complexity, you also increase the fracturing, right, and your ability to actually mitigate it and stave off catastrophe. Now, some will want to put this in their political bent. This is not a political statement. This is a statement on the reality of where we're at as a nation. Okay? When I tell you that we have to have a true middle to bridge the gap and a vision for the country, right? I am serious. It is very important that we do that. If we do not do that, everybody's going to hurt. Everybody's going to suffer, and a lot of people are probably going to die in what occurs in the consequences for not heeding those warnings. It always brings calamity. So, we have to come together and work together to overcome things. There's been a lot of very foolish decisions that have been made to try to cover up stuff, try to put down others, right? That is unwise. That only digs a deeper hole and destabilizes your position, undermining it even faster, creating greater consequences, right? So we have to deal with things as they are, not as you'd like them to be, as they are. I want you to consider that. Because as it is for people, so too it is for the nation. Hey, no problem. It's pretty interesting, isn't it? It makes you wonder, did they have any prior warnings, right? I was sitting out here the other night and I was thinking about what happened down in Florida. And I guarantee you, probably somebody gave a warning and they didn't listen to them.
Do you know the
Not all of it.
There were small classes from the very beginning.
Oh, there were small ones.
Yeah, lots of them. They believed up to 900 died in the 12th floor.
So they did know.
And they closed it down and weren't using it, and they were working on it to open it, to run it 24/7. So
Oh, they did know.
it was dangerous.
I'll be doggone. Yeah.
Yeah, because Union Hill is 9 students on way, which means way.
Yeah.
So, and that's why there were any attempts there was the attempts to recover the bodies of the accident happened. And there have been 2 attempts to excavate since, and every time they've said it was entirely too dangerous.
Interesting.
There's been sinkholes in Churchill attributed.
I'll be doggone.
But I'm sure this is totally safe, don't worry about it. Yeah.
I don't. It's like being on the internet. I don't consider anything safe or open to somebody hacking it. Yeah. Enjoy. You bet. So what I was talking to them about was here on my property is a tunnel, the famous Churchill Tunnel, and what these folks came in, they wanted to see it because it's a historic site. And back in 1927, they were doing work on the tunnel, trying to fix it, and it collapsed and killed a lot of folks. And it's actually basically a gravesite. And so I saw these folks walk up a few minutes ago, and they were looking through the fence because they couldn't get in, and they wanted to see the historic site, so I let them in. It's interesting as they were walking out, you probably heard it, right? I think I was recording, that what had occurred, I'm like, I bet somebody had warned prior to the collapse, just like what had occurred down in Florida with the condominium building. There's always warnings, right? And so she, I don't know if you can hear it, I'll try to boost the audio, but she actually was told me part of the story I didn't know, which was that actually there were warnings and they were ignored. There were small collapses throughout the tunnel leading up to the day when the whole tunnel collapsed. And so, yeah, I mean, almost every time there's a catastrophic event, right? Some people may call them black swans, right? An unforeseen event. Well, what I'm here to say is that there are always people that do catch the warning signs and try to warn people. Now, how does that apply to anything else? Well, anybody could throw a warning out there, right? But if they can back it up. Well, in this case, right, you had a tunnel that goes to Churchill, right, for trains, and they had already had partial collapses, right? But people were ignoring the safety of it, right? So it wound up leading to a bunch of people dying, right? Just like the warnings down in Florida that occurred, right? There were people warning about the collapse of the condominium building, right? What I'm saying is that when people are warning you over and over, and they're laying out the reasons for it, right? They're giving you evidence, and you ignore that. Well, you're actually culpable for having been complacent and complicit with your denial or somebody else's perspective that didn't want to deal with it. Usually has to deal with finances, with money, right? You're culpable for that, right? So if you're warned about something that's occurring or about to occur, and you ignore it, right? Because you don't want to deal with it, because it's going to cost you something, you're going to have to risk something, right? To actually do something about it. Well, guess what? That means you're at fault, right? So what I'm telling you is, when you apply that to national security, right? You apply that, what I'm trying to tell you is when you apply that to national security, when you apply that to the world around you, from the macro to the micros, and from the micros to the macro, when you're warned about something, right? When people are warning you and you refuse to heed the information given to you, right? And worse yet, you actually demonize them, right? You silence them, you censor them, right? You make enemies out of them, right? What you're doing is you're working against your own best interests, right? That means you're culpable. Okay? Now apply that, right, to foreign policy and domestic policy. Right? There's nothing that happens in a vacuum here. When you're told that you are doing something that is leading you down the wrong path and you refuse to heed it, well, that's on you. Right? But it doesn't just stop there. Your choices affect everybody else. Your choices, right, do not happen in a vacuum. And when you're told, if you don't stop doing this, you're going to pay the consequences, right? We're serious. And how do you do that? Well, in your pride, right, you create the conditions for your fall. In your fear, right, and confusion, you create the conditions, right, that manufacture, right, the environment for you in your pride to fall. There is a reason why it is that we say where the leaders have no vision, the people perish. They perish because of pride, because they refuse to actually heed, right, the warnings. Especially when we're providing warnings for you and offering solutions for you for the entirety of the country, right? When we're doing stuff, we're providing things for you. We're offering to you a way out of your predicament. right? And you kick against that. You fight against us, right? What you're doing is you are actually, by default, accepting responsibility for the outcomes thereof, right? More wealth, more power, more control, more influence, more, right? Will not change that, right? It will only amplify the consequences, and you do it to yourself. So just like the tunnel, where the warnings went unheeded, right? It cost a lot of people's lives. And that usually boils down to financial, right? Somebody doesn't want to do something because it could cost them money, right? Well, you're exposed in your greed, right? You see, if you're not willing to do the right thing in leadership, whether in the public or private sector, there are consequences. And those consequences are yours to bear. Now, if you humble yourselves and take responsibility for it, well, then there's a way out. But if you're unwilling to do that, you create your own consequences, and they scale exponentially. They amplify. And as they amplify, right, the weight upon you and the fear, false evidence appearing real, scales exponentially, right? Right? And you become myopic. Your decision making becomes impaired, and you create even worse situations because your myopathy focuses you on the minor, right? You major on the minors instead of actually focusing on what you should be focusing on, which are the major things, creating a larger, more expansive, major problem down line for you to deal with, and major consequences that scale. That's somebody right there in that helicopter, probably learning this the hard way, right? As they're being taken over to the trauma one, level 1 trauma center over here, right? So the same thing that applies for individuals also applies for the nation, right? And it also applies between nations and collectively for all of humanity. So I want you to consider that in light of the days that we're in and the situations that we're dealing with. There's a reason why when we say there's a way, we have solutions for this. There are things that we can do, right, to mitigate these things. And there's a reason why we tell you ahead of time. We have foresight, okay? We can see down line, right? But if you choose not to do that, that's on you, right? That's not on us. That's on you. That's your responsibility. And if you try to put that on others, again, you're only amplifying the consequences, right? You're only amplifying the consequences. And that means that your consequences will be exponentially more hard to deal with, and it will expose you. You see, in your pride, your greed, your avarice, and your hubris, you know, the temptation is to control, hide. The more you do that, the more you're exposing yourself. It actually works against you, right? So what I'm trying to tell you here is you need to learn the lesson now, because if you don't learn it now, you'll be paying the entire consequences later. And that later is coming soon, right? Coming soon to a person near you, an organization near you, a nation near you, maybe your own, right? There's a reason why we say as it is for people, so too it is for nations. Nothing happens, right, in a vacuum. So that being said, when we tell you, right, when I use the terminology, there are snakes in your garden, right, that's a warning to you. You're compromised. You've got big problems. And if we don't deal with them now, right, it's going to be a bigger problem, right? Just like what they're experiencing. Half the country's on fire. We have water issues. We have all kinds of problems. A lot of us already had solutions. We've been trying to get you to do something about it for years. You fought us. You ignored it. You were in denial about it. Now it's on you. It's not on us. It's on you. It's your consequences, right? And all those people, right, that are suffering, it's on you. Now you can keep fighting about it. You can keep blaming us for it, but we're just going to actually expose you even faster, right? You can humble yourself, and will work with you to actually mitigate the consequences that have already now started. But that's on you. You do it to yourself. You see, you make enemies out of those who warn you. And you don't want to hear that, right? We're the bad people, right? We're condemning you, or whatever. No, you're condemning yourselves. You are. Every day you prove it by the outcomes of your decision making and your policies, right? So either you're an imbecile and an idiot, or you're an arrogant fool and an imbecile and an idiot because you're working against your best interests. Because you're so myopic, all you can see is what you want now. Now, what does that sound like? A drug addict. Sounds like an addict. So meanwhile, your enemies are tunneling underneath your society, underneath your opportunities. They're tunneling underneath your own skin and your own lives. And what do? You make enemies out of the people that are actually telling you and warning you that there's got to be a change. I'm not a politico. I can't stand either party. Right now, this isn't about parties. This isn't about anything. This is about survival of the nation and doing what's best for the entire country. You will not do that from your polarity. Right? You will only increase your consequences. So you need to consider that. You need to consider why I'm telling you that. Because the moment that you chose that you wanted to go into leadership for whatever your reasoning is, whether it's careerism, reputation, whatever the hell it is, right? You accepted by default. By default, you accepted the consequences and the higher level, right, of accountability and responsibility that comes with being a leader. If you weren't willing to handle that, then you should never gone into leadership in the first place, right? Because that means you're not built for that, right? And in times of crisis, everything gets exposed. You get tested. Although, if you don't understand that by now, if you don't understand these things by now, after all that's happened over the last few years, right? There's no remedy for you. Which means you will continue trying to control, silence, censor, right, accuse, and slander. And all you're doing is exposing yourself, creating the conditions for your own downfall. You'll do it to yourself. I don't have to do a damn thing, right? You're hanging yourself with your own rope, right? Because you're never going to defeat us. We'll just replace the country with something else if you destroy it. But it's in your best interest and the interest of these people who we actually care about, right? To actually tell you these things and fight for them. Right? That's what real leadership is. And when you're ready for real leadership in this country, a lot of us are willing to actually step into those roles and be servant leaders and do what's necessary to help the entire country, not your special interest groups, not your private interests, right? But we don't want to live in your oligarchy, and we don't want to live in your false paradigms and your bullshit lies, your machinations and intrigues, right? So consider what I'm telling you, right? Before you have to wind up on one of those because you didn't listen and you pissed off the wrong people, right? And they medevac you in for emergency surgery. Start listening. We don't warn you because we're bored. We warn you because we care. Now, if you don't care, well, then you shouldn't care if we remove you from positions of power, because you shouldn't be there, because we care about everybody else that your decisions affect. And as it is for people, so too it is for nations. Go and chew on that.